All right, well, Genesis chapter 20. I don't know about you, but it's good for me to get back in the rhythm of study. Because if I don't have something that I need to do for a certain time, I just don't do it. I think part of the reason is that I love to do it so much that I think I should be working, instead of lollygagging around and reading and studying. But now it becomes my job. I get to do it, And I was thinking yesterday, I don't remember even what it was, but something that Pastor Pat said that I made a note of, that things that we get to do. I get to do this. And it's such an excitement for me. Of course, I really felt like I was rattled last week and scattered, especially with that incident causing us to have to cancel here. As we've talked about, Joe and I went ahead with the live stream. So we didn't come down till almost time for it to start. As I told you, then I found out somebody had come earlier. I hated that, but anyway. So, but in doing, when I was planning that and writing that review, not knowing if we would have new people or not, and how much I would need to cover, and how much do you want to cover? Do you just want to talk about it? So I wrote all this stuff down, but then I felt like I was just really scattered. So, but I questioned myself if I was doing this study. I won't say it the right way, because what's right, but am I doing it the best way? And so this past week, after Bible study last week, I ran across a teaching by a good friend of mine, Jennifer Mathewson Spear. I've mentioned her before. Her husband, Dana Mathewson, was pastor at Buffett Heights for years. Dana married Joe and Suzanne. But after he passed away, she later remarried and moved to Florida. She has a ministry down there, women's teaching ministry. And she has a teaching. They're doing Revelation right now. And so this study that I watched from her last week, by the way, I'll try to put the link to it in the email this week. It was one of, if not the best teaching I have ever heard on Revelation 19 through 22. I mean, she covered all the bases. The end of the tribulation, the great white, the millennial reign, the great white throne judgment, the eternal state. I mean, in a way that was just wonderful. The teaching was great, but because the way she teaches, she just starts right in. So I'm going to try that. So we're going to try it a little bit differently for a little while anyway. Instead of discussing up front, what you read, questions that you might have, because we usually end up answering those questions as we go along. So what I'm going to do is just jump right into the chapter, and if you have questions along, ask them, and then I'm going to try to make myself have time at the end just to discuss, maybe something that intrigued you or something that surprised you or whatever about the chapter. And as I was thinking about this, if you can let me know later whether you like it this way or not. As I heard someone say this week, I'll take it under advisement. I might or might not do it, but I'll take it under advisement. So I'm just going to jump right into chapter 20. So you're going to need your map. So be sure and get that out first thing. And I talked about this last week. I tried in the lessons that I wrote for each chapter. Of course, you have that overview section it's just things to look for to kind of jumpstart your study. You could use that with anything you're studying. But as I wrote these pages for each chapter, I tried to use questions that I'm going to try to answer, or things that I'm going to try to answer as we go along. If I miss something, be sure and ask me about it. And I've also added at the bottom what I call the application and takeaway thoughts. I'm not real good at application. That's never been my strong suit, but I've tried to find things that would give us a takeaway from this chapter. So if you think of other things, and I would encourage you to share those with me, that will really help out. So, and always as you're studying the chapter, you're reading the chapter, let me encourage you to have your map handy. make sure you know, anytime that a name of a place is given, make sure you know where that's at. Just like we've often talked about, anytime that there's a pronoun, make sure you know who that is. Trace it back up through the verses if you need to find out who it's talking about. And we'll see that as we start right off with this. So you've heard the old adage that says when you point a finger at someone, there's three fingers pointing back at you. Well, that's what happened to me in this lesson. This lesson really convicted me about how much am I really trusting God. And so I titled this lesson, Here We Go Again. One commentary said it's a sad commentary on one's lack of faith if God has to deliver him or her again and again. And I added under that in my book, and yet God does, and aren't we thankful that he does. So we come to chapter 20, and the first word is now. Now, Abraham journeyed from there toward the land of the Negev. So let's just stop right there. We see right off that this verse connects back to the chapters that we've just read. It connects to something that's already happened. So where is he traveling from, and why? What prompted him to leave where he was, and where was he? So as we finished up last time, Abraham had just watched the total destruction of the cities of the plain, at least 4 of the 5 cities surrounding the southern end of the Dead Sea. If you look back at chapter 19, probably just on the other page, verses 27 through 28 we read. Now this is as Sodom and Gomorrah and the other 3 cities, Zoar wasn't destroyed, but 4 cities were being destroyed. Verse 27 of chapter 19 says, Now Abraham rose early in the morning and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Remember, they had that discussion of what was going to happen. Verse 28, And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace. So can you imagine what's going through his mind at that time? You know, if you remember when we did that chapter, we said he probably didn't sleep much that night, wondering what was happening. At that time, he didn't know that Lot and his daughters had escaped. Can you imagine how he felt, thinking that they were destroyed? And so I suspect, and we're not told, but I suspect that Abraham couldn't stand the thought of living there any longer and looking down on that day after day after day, at least for the time being. Now, he will come back to this place later. We'll see that in chapter 23. But for now, he leaves. So look again at verse 1. Now, Abraham journeyed from there, and where is he? That's the oaks of Mamre. You can see that in chapter 18, verse 1. That tells us where he is. From there, toward the land of the Negev. Now, the Negev is anything in this south country here. And he settled between Kadesh and Gerar. And my translation says, Then he sojourned in Gerar. So where he headed to, you can see on this map, here is Kadesh. It's called Kadesh Barnea. And over here at the edge is the wilderness of Shur. So he's headed right up here where it says Hebron. That's where he's leaving, and he's headed this direction. Gerar, can't pronounce it. Gerar is right up here on the plate down closer to the Mediterranean Sea. So he's headed. That's where he's headed. By the way, this is pretty much the same track that Hagar took when she ran away. In chapter 16. You remember, she went to the wilderness of Shur. She was going toward that, and this, not really know how to pronounce it, Bir Laharoi, that's where the angel of the Lord spoke to her. So that's the direction that he's headed. So you get that in your mind. That's where they're going. Now, some commentaries suggest that or as my translation reads it, they went to Kadesh and Shur first and then went back to Gerar. Or the NIV suggests that they went through Gerar on their way to Kadesh, because it says that they settled between Kadesh and Shur, but they sojourned in Gerar, meaning they were just there temporarily. They weren't there very long. Some commentaries suggest that they went to the area of Kadesh and Shur first, then Abraham left his herds and herdsmen there, and then he and Sarah went back up to this city. We don't really know, and you might say, well, what's it matter? Well, it matters because when you think about who was with Abraham and Sarah when they went into Gerar. Was it just the two of them? Or was it Abraham and all his entourage going traipsing through the city? I mean, he had large herds, he had lots of servants, he had lots of herdsmen. My opinion is, I don't know for sure, but my opinion is that he went down and settled there with everybody, and then he and Sarah went back up to Gerar. That may or may not be it, but we have to remember that Abraham had a daily life. You know, we was talking about earlier about me using that Civil War book and saying that it's real history. You know, this is real. We don't have all the details that went on from day to day, but it's real. And so they had a daily life. We talked about that when we studied chapter 17, the chapter after chapter 16, and that incident with Hagar. And we said there's 13 years passed between the end of chapter 16 and chapter 17. What had their daily life become? Yeah, you've got a tiny baby. And then the baby grows up and does all the things that babies do and toddlers do and young children do. And then he's 13 years old. What was their daily life like? Regardless of what kind of a dysfunctional family it had become with Hagar and Sarah, they still settled into some sort of a routine. You just, I mean, there's food to be cooked. There's laundry to be done. You settle into a routine. I told you then that our son Joe Jr. calls life Groundhog Day because he says it's the same thing every day. But life goes on, yeah, as the Beatles sang. But anyway, Abraham, as we know, was very wealthy. He had large herds, as I said, of sheep and oxen, and he had lots of servants and lots of herdsmen to care for them. And we'll see, what's interesting is everywhere he goes, people keep giving him more herds and more servants everywhere he goes. Now, some of the commentaries, I know what they mean. I just kind of chafe at this title, but they call him a tribal chieftain. I just don't like that term. I know what they're getting at, but we could even call him a successful businessman. Because his flocks are growing, his work is growing, everyone is growing, but you could call him blessed of God, too. And there is that Abrahamic covenant. But for whatever reason, whether Hebron had become a painful place for him, or whether they just needed fresh pasture for the herds. Now we know, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, what happened in chapter 12, but we know that he went to Egypt originally because there was a famine in the land. And I got kind of tickled at some of the commentaries. You got to be real careful not to read into things. Because one of the commentaries said that there was another famine. Now, nowhere does it say that there was another famine. But you can lean toward that because of what happened in chapter 12. And actually, it will happen again to Isaac later. But nowhere in here does it say that there was a reason like that for him to go. Now, he may have gone because he needed fresh pasture. But it doesn't say that there was a famine. So, for whatever reason, he left, Abraham and his whole family, and everyone connected to him set out for the Negev, for the Southland. And actually, as we said, they traveled toward the place where Hagar was headed when she ran off in chapter 16. And here's, again, we're talking about, you may get tired of hearing me say this, real events with real people in real time. this whole thing takes place, this whole episode, all the traveling and all this episode in chapter 20 takes place within the 3 months time span between chapter 18, verse 10, where God tells Sarah, or tells Abraham, with Sarah listening. Let me go back and read that. He said, that's God, I will surely return to you at this time next year, in 1 year, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And then since Sarah was listening from the tent, which was behind him. Sometime between that announcement and chapter 21, verses 1 and 2, which says, Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. So we're in that 3 months time frame. She's not pregnant yet. The 9 months haven't commenced yet, but it's going to be within the next year, so we got 3 months. So that's where we are. God had promised, Sarah is, remember, she's 90 years old. That soak in. But God had promised to make her able, not just to conceive, not just to open her womb that she'd been barren all these years, but to make her physically able to get pregnant and to carry a child and then to nurse that child. How did God do that? You know, I don't know about you, but I remember reading this over the years, not really thinking it through logically, but just thinking that here's this run-of-the-mill 90-year-old woman that gets pregnant. I mean, think of someone you know that's 90 years old.
But their 90 isn't equal to ours.
It isn't, but it's not equal to ours because they will live, Abraham, I forget how well, what's my thing say? What's that first page say? How long does he live?
Was it 170?
175 years. So he lives, another 75 years. You're right, after Isaac is born. So it is. But still, when you and I read that, I always did just think of a 90-year-old woman. And it's this regular run-of-the-mill 90-year-old woman that's pregnant.
Well, it does say that well past.
It does. Yeah. And I'm going to read that in a minute from what's said in Hebrews about them. But here's the thing. Even though the ages are not the same as ours, something miraculous happened. Think what happened to her body? What happened to her skin? What happened to her stamina? I know many people need a nap every day, and they're not anywhere near 90 years old. But Jewish tradition tells us that God miraculously restored Sarah's youth. That's what the Jewish belief on this is. He restored her youth. In fact, and this is what Hebrews said. Hebrews 11:11 tells us, through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age. So even though their ages were not the same as ours, she was past age. And then it goes on to say, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And I think whatever happened to her likely happened to Abraham too. Now we know that Abraham will father other children by Keturah after Sarah dies. But the reason I think that, what's a new lease on life? We hear that. It's like they got a new lease on life. They got a do-over. They got the ability to start over as if they were way younger. Again, verse 12 of Hebrews 11, speaking of Abraham, says, therefore sprang there even of one, meaning Abraham, and then he says, and him as good as dead. so many as the stars of the sky, the multitude, and the sand which is by the seashore, innumerable. So whatever it was, something miraculous happened. Whether it affected how they looked, or it affected their abilities to just, I shared the story with you of being in the running long jump. There's no way I could be in a running long jump. I can't run like that. I can still run a little bit, but I certainly can't jump. But when God says you can, you can. And so whatever happened to them, I believe happened to both of them. So, but at any rate, here they are. They're traveling from Hebron, as we see there on the map, to the Negev. Maybe it was their newfound strength that caused them to, hey, we can go somewhere else. We feel like it now. But anyway, God had said that by that time next year, they would have a child. Finally, they could see that the promised heir was to come, was at least in sight. They knew it would at least be within the next year. But there's still one more test that Abraham and Sarah must face. They've come a long way, especially Abraham. We've talked about getting to know them, and that's one of the things that I want us to do as we go through, finish up with Abraham and Sarah, and we go to Isaac, and then Rebekah, and then Jacob and Esau. I want us to get to know them. Look for any attribute that describes them. Make note of those things that describes them. But we know that they've come a long way. We've seen some of the things that Abraham has done, some of the ways that he's failed, and then we've watched him come back and come before God. He has talked face to face with God, or at least the pre-incarnate Christ there in chapter 18. He has prayed for, he has pleaded and interceded for others to be saved. But here's the question. Did Abraham and Sarah really trust God to take care of them? No matter where, no matter when.
Not in this chapter.
Not in this chapter. Exactly. Not exactly. And here's the thing. I don't know about you, but isn't it a lot easier to pray for someone else to trust God than it is for us to trust God? There's that, three fingers pointing back at you. It certainly is for me. Now, as we've said, whether they are all living between Kadesh and Shur, and by the way, the Israelites hearing this will know exactly where that is. That was part of the area that they've just been going around and around in for the last 40 years. They know that area well. So whether they're all living there and Abraham and Sarah traveled to Gerar, or whether they all go there, we don't really know. But at any rate, it becomes obvious or becomes known that this stranger in town is wealthy. And then something happens, and we'll find out later, but something happens that makes him think that this is an unsafe place. I couldn't help it as I was making those notes and studying that I was reminded, if you've seen any of the Star Wars movies, particularly the first one, the first Star Wars movie where Luke and old Ben go into this city, and there's all this evil and lawlessness and all these bad guys everywhere and all these weird creatures. And, you immediately know that this is not a good place to be. Or if you're more of an old Westerns, they ride into town and they immediately know that this is not a place where they want to be. But something happens. I mean, they just come into the city and, something is going on that they're uneasy about immediately. Now, Gerar is about 50 miles from Hebron. And Gerar is the big city. It's the capital of the Philistine territory. And yes, there were Philistines in the land long before David's time. So Who knows? Maybe Abraham and Sarah travel there to do business. Maybe they're going there to sell some of their herds. Or maybe they are on their way to the Negev and they go through here. After all, this is on a major trade route. But one of the dictionaries said that it was a very fertile region all the way down between Shur and Kadesh. So they come through there, or they go there on purpose, but the word gets around. I mean, they obviously look different than everybody, and the word travels fast. Now, the Philistines descended from Noah's son Ham. They were originally a seagoing people, probably originally coming from the island of Crete. They're sometimes referred to as the sea people. And they were quite different from these Canaanites that Abraham had interaction with these past 25 years. Henry Morris, in his commentary, says, the stress of the immediate situation confronting Abraham and Sarah caught them unaware. They didn't expect this when they got there. As I said in your lesson from 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, if you think you're standing strong, be careful not to fall. Don't say, oh, I've dealt with this before. Don't get too sure of yourself. So imagine riding into town, however it is that they come. Abraham is obviously rich. Beautiful Sarah is by his side. And imagine the men yelling out vulgarities as they come through. Kill the husband. Take the wife. Take all their goods. And Abraham just almost without thinking, saying, no, she's my sister. And once he says that, he's sunk. So, verse 2. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, we don't know why Abimelech took Sarah, whether it was because she had been miraculously rejuvenated and looked really good, rejuvenated to conceive Isaac. She looked and acted much younger than her 90 years. Or maybe it was politically advantageous to add her to his harem. I mean, we see that this sister of a very wealthy man. There are a lot of politically arranged marriages in those days, and probably in our own day as well throughout the world. And you think of Solomon. I meant to go back and look. What was it? I can't remember how many wives. Some 700 wives. Almost all of those were political alliances. I'd say all of them were. And so that's what they did. Just as a political alliance to add this wife or this sister of a wealthy man to his harem. I mean, what could go wrong there? But for whatever reason it was, Sarah was taken to Abimelech's palace or house or whatever it was. But let me add here that the name Abimelech is just a title. Like Pharaoh. That was not his name. We will encounter him again at the end of chapter 21, and then again we will encounter another Abimelech many years later, too many years for it to be the same one. So that's a title, just like Pharaoh is a title. But whatever the title the ruler has, it's like, here we go again. So let's talk about this a minute. I do want to discuss this. In your lesson, I asked you to compare and contrast this incident with the incident in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20, with Abram and Sarai going down to Egypt. How was it alike, and how was it different? Did you put those side by side and look at them and look for things that were alike and things that were different?
Both times he said she was his sister.
Both times he said she's my sister. That's the same thing, and it's not technically a lie. So he did that both times.
God struck Pharaoh's house with plagues and whatnot.
Yeah.
And Abimelech, or whatever his name is, God told him,
Yeah.
and your wives are all going to be barren.
Did God speak to Pharaoh, though?
Maybe in a dream.
Well, no. If it was a dream, we're not told. He did not.
The Lord struck Pharaoh.
Not only plagues, but great plagues.
Yeah.
And Pharaoh is the one that figured it out. He surmised that it was because of Sarah, because it happened immediately when Sarah came in. The circumstances are different. What caused them to go to Egypt the first time? A famine. What caused them to go now? We don't really know, but nowhere does it say that it was a famine. No mention of a famine. Okay. Another thing that was the same is that Sarah was taken. There was nothing Abraham could do about it. It appears, to me, it appears that in chapter 12, they had been there for a while before Pharaoh took Sarah. And here it seems like it's almost immediately, just by the way it's worded. Another thing that's different, we talked about this already. Sarah was protected in different ways. In chapter 12, great plagues came upon Pharaoh, which caused him to figure it out. Here, what happened? A dream. God spoke to Abimelech in a dream. And something happened. We don't know what happened here. Well, we know plagues there. We don't know what kind. But we don't know exactly what happened here. But we do know the result of whatever it was that happened. And that was that it at least affected Abimelech and all the women in his household. Now, we're not really told if it affected the men, but it affected them in some way. Whatever thing happened was revealed to Abimelech in a dream. Whatever it was happened first, and then God speaks to him in a dream and essentially says, this is what's going on.
So he had to be a believer for him to have that dream and to recognize it.
Not necessarily. Think of other times that God spoke to unbelievers in a dream. There was Nebuchadnezzar. I've got it down here a little further somewhere. Several. I'll find it, I'll tell you. But when I get there, I'll tell you. But not necessarily a believer, but at least receptive.
Yeah. Bad people can do good things.
Yes, they can. There are some very honest and very moral people who are not believers. And then there are some believers that, like, okay, not going to go down that road. So, but here's the thing: the riches. When did When did Abram get the riches from Pharaoh?
When he found out that Sarah was his wife.
From Pharaoh.
From Pharaoh.
When he was leaving?
No.
Didn't Pharaoh give it to him after he found out?
Nope.
Oh, he gave it to you. You're right. Of course you're right.
I'm the teacher. I looked it up. When did he give him the stuff?
After he took her.
And Pharaoh gave Abraham all this stuff for Sarah. When did he get the stuff now? Afterward. After it was over, then he gets the stuff. We'll talk about that more in a minute, of why that was. But here's one more thing that's different. And I tried my best in some of these lessons to keep them at least PG rated. One more thing that's different. In chapter 12, even if Pharaoh had relations with Sarah, she couldn't have gotten pregnant because she was barren. Now, she could have. because God has healed her body, rejuvenated her. So that makes,
that could have been,
yeah, that opens up a whole different danger here.
yeah. If God hadn't done that, then
Exactly.
who is the father?
Yeah, exactly. Who is the father of this child? Exactly. Now, many commentaries talked about the danger to the seed, the heir of the line of Abraham. And there is that. If Sarah had had sex with Abimelech, even if she bore, as you said, even if she bore Isaac later, there would always have been the question of who was the father. He had to be Abraham's son. And while that's very important theologically, in order for the line, in order for all this to transpire and come down to Jesus, that's very important theologically, and I don't want to diminish that. But we all know that. So I want to take this a little bit different. I want us to focus on, in a minute, what caused Abraham to say this time, she is my sister. I think that's what we need to hear, or at least I do. So first, look at how God rescued Sarah. As we said in chapter 12, God had sent great plagues on Pharaoh, but here's something else that happened. He sent this pagan king, here it is, Sherry. He sent this pagan king a dream, and then we have that dialogue in verses 3 through 7. But this is not the only pagan that God warned or spoke to in a dream. Later in Genesis, in chapter 31, we'll see God speak to Laban in a dream. We won't get to that this spring. That'll be up in the fall. But when Jacob is there, when he goes back to there and he's married to Leah and Rachel, God will speak to Laban in a dream. And Laban, we'll talk about when we get to him, is he a believer or not? But even if he is, he still has what they call his household gods. He has other gods that he worships. God will bring dreams to a butler and a baker as well as Pharaoh in chapters 40 and 41. Remember, Joseph's in prison and the butler and the baker have these dreams and Joseph interprets for them. God gave them those dreams. And of course, they get out and immediately promptly forget to tell anybody. But then Pharaoh has that dream, the 7 healthy cows and the 7 lean ones. God speaks to him. God speaks to Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2. And even in the New Testament, we find Pilate's wife, remember that? Going to Pilate saying, don't have anything to do with this man. God has spoken to me in a dream. So, there's that whole rabbit trail that we could go down as to how God speaks to people who don't even believe in him. We don't really have time to get into that, but that's a whole topic in itself. But in this case, it all begins with my favorite words in the Bible. But God. Verses 3, I'm going to read this through and talk about these as we go through verses 3 through 7. But God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, behold, that's a powerful word in Scripture. Behold, you are a dead man. How'd you like to have a dream like that? Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is married. Now, apparently it's okay for him to have a whole harem of women as long as you're not married to somebody else. But the fact that she was married changes everything. It's like, I draw the line somewhere. Don't take married women. She's married. So verse 4, the plea. Now Abimelech, Moses gives us this bit of information. Now Abimelech had not come near her. And he knew he hadn't. And he said, Lord, now let me back up. In verse 3, the word, the title for God there is Elohim. We've talked about it in all our studies. But God, Elohim, simply God. In verse 4, when he says Lord, this is not Jehovah. This is Adonai. Remember, we talked about the difference between Adonai and Jehovah, whether it's capital L, lowercase O-R-D, or in all caps. When it's capital L, lowercase O-R-D, that is the title Adonai, and it can just simply mean sir, or it can mean master. But whatever it means, it is someone who is in authority over you. He does not know about the one true God, but he knows that whoever is saying this to him is in authority over him. And he knows that whoever is saying this to him knows what's going on. Now, this is one of those chapters that's a little hard to tie it all together if you take it verse by verse as it goes, because we get the information later. And you want to go later and pull that information back in. But we know something's going on. We know from the later information that something is going on, and that's probably on his mind when he goes to sleep. And so with this master saying to him, you're a dead man, and because of the woman you've taken, for she is married, he immediately connects whatever's happening with the fact that she's married. So Abimelech knows he's not come near it, Lord. And he says, will you slay a nation even though blameless? Now, where have we heard a plea like that before? From Abraham. That's almost, the word for slay here and the word for destroy there is two different words. But except for that, it's almost exactly the same plea. Abraham cried out, will you slay the wicked with the righteous? And then that's what Abimelech does. Will you slay a nation, even though they've done nothing wrong? They're blameless. And then he gives his defense. And he says, did he, speaking of Abraham, not himself say to me, she is my sister, and she herself? Remember what we've always said about two pronouns together? And it's almost together there earlier. Did he not himself, you could say, did not he himself say to me, and she herself said, he is my brother. They said that of their own volition. Nobody forced them to say that. They volunteered that. And then he says, Abimelech says, in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I've done this. In my heart, you know my motives. You know that I did not intend to bring a married woman into my harem. And in my hands, the innocence of my hands, I have not touched her, and you know this. So then verse 6, this says, then God said to him in the dream. But actually, and I didn't really know how to, I knew what the commentary said, but I didn't know how to find it. What the commentaries say is that there is the definite article the there in verse 6. Then the God said to him. We saw back when Enoch walked with the God and was no more. I was simply trusting the commentaries, but I found in one of my Bibles how to see when it does that now. But now it's not just a deity out there somewhere. This is the God. The God said to him, the Abimelech, in the dream. Now let me say this. Several of the commentaries said that these were two separate dreams. That he had the first one and didn't do anything, and then the second one. Just the way it reads to me, it's one seamless dream. Then the God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart, your motives were pure, you have done this. And here it says, God, the deity, I also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. You may have thought that was your idea. You may have thought this malady, whatever it is that they're all dealing with, kept you from touching her. But no, that was me. I kept you from doing this. God said God's protection of this pagan king God said, I kept you. Literally what it's saying is, I restrained you from sinning against me. And I did not let you touch her. Now, the question comes up, how did God do that? Whatever had happened to them prevented it. Now, we'll find out later, again, that something happened to Abimelech, apparently happened to all the household, that prevented them from having children. Now, this is not simply from, not simply that no children were born while Abraham was there. If that had been it, it would have been something that happened 9 months earlier. But that's not it. I found it somewhere, and then I couldn't find it again in my notes, but somewhere it said that this meant that they were not able to bear, or not able to conceive children. So we don't know exactly what it was. It was but something happened to prevent everyone, at least in the court. Now, we don't know if it was everybody in the land. I don't know. It just doesn't say. But something happened to prevent everyone around him from even being able to have sexual relations. Therefore, no babies would be born. If it were saying that no babies were born, they'd have to be there a long time to make sure nobody, a long time. But so it has to be something that prevented pregnancy. If it was some type of a disease or some type of malady that hit the entire kingdom, you know that it's happening to everybody. So this is on everybody's mind. And then when God comes to Abimelech in a dream, Abimelech immediately knows what he's referring to. So then we come to verse 7 as the dream continues. God says, now therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet. I'm like, what? He's a prophet? And he lied to me to my face? Yeah, he's a prophet. And he will pray for you. I've heard some people, not people that I know personally, but people on TV or whatever, say, our prayers are with you. And I'm not sure I want you praying for me. You've seen some of those people, but he's going to pray for you. Okay, so he'll pray for you and you will live. Well, if you're about to die, you're going to take anybody's prayer. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die. That's that same phrase that's used in chapter 2 when God told Adam, if you eat from this tree, you will surely die. It's actually the imperative of that. It's actually die repeated. You will die. You will surely die. Not only you, but all who are yours. So, what's he going to do? Would he harden his heart and say, it was just a dream? Would he say, who's this God that thinks he can tell me what to do? Or would he listen? Well, he was desperate, so he listened. Look at verse 8. So Abimelech rose early the next morning, I bet he did, and called all his servants and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were greatly frightened. You think? They were greatly frightened. The King James says they were sore afraid. Maybe they'd heard about Sodom and Gomorrah. What's God going to do with this? This is not that far distance-wise from those cities. I'm sure they knew what happened there. Maybe whatever it was that's going on with all of them physically convinced them that this God is telling the truth. So that's Abimelech's encounter with God and his response. Now, Abimelech calls Abraham in and berates him, likely in front of all his servants. Look at verses 9 and 10. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? So that's why I think they're all still there. And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And then verse 10, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what have you encountered that you have done such a thing? In other words, what caused you to do this? Why have you done this to me? What have you done? Why have you done it? And what caused you to even think of such a thing? So Abimelech rebukes Abraham in front of everybody. So that's Abimelech's encounter with God, and now his encounter with Abraham. And so now here's Abraham gives 3 excuses. First, verse 11, and Abraham said, because I thought surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Number 2, verse 12, besides, she actually is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And number 3, and it came about when God, like Adam, he's blaming God now. When God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, this is the kindness, or this is how this is good in your sight, or this is how you'll show that you love me. That everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. So let's break those down. First of all, Abraham was afraid. Something caused him to be afraid. Abraham said, because I thought surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me. Lord Wiersbe said that when Abraham arrived in Gerar, he began to walk by sight and not by faith. How do we know that? Because he said, it looks like, when he said surely, something caused him to think that way. Surely there is no fear of God in this place. Something caused him to think that. We don't know what it was. But Abraham stopped asking what is right and started asking what is safe. Did he think that because the people of this city didn't fear God, didn't believe in God like he did, that God couldn't protect him here? That God could only protect him, when he's somewhere else. God can't protect him here. Do we think that God can only protect us in certain places or in certain kinds of needs? We have to trust what we know. This is what you've probably heard me say this before. This is one of my favorite scriptures that you have to know the context on. I mean, there's a ton of them, but this is one of the biggies for me. John 16:33. You hear this quoted all the time. Jesus said, in the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. What's the rest of it? For I have overcome the world. What you've got to know is that when Jesus said that, he is on his way to the cross. In a few hours, it wouldn't look like he'd overcome anything. He'd be dead. But you got to go by what you know and not what it looks like. But here's another thing that Warren Wiersbe said, and that was that Abraham and Sarah had failed to judge this sin of saying, that they were brother and sister when they dealt with it in Egypt. Now, I may be wrong here, and this is strictly my opinion. But I'm not sure that Abraham and Sarah realized that this was the sin that needed dealing with in Egypt. Let me explain that. We talked about that then, that this was an acceptable law of the land in the Code of Hammurabi. That this was allowable if a man and his wife felt like they were in danger. That they could do this when they went into a city. That was the accepted law of the land. That was used in many dangerous places. So think again about why they went to Egypt in the first place. What was it? Famine. They went because of famine. What did they fail to trust God for? Food. Provision. We might connote that to finances. They failed to trust God for provision and his providing for them. Now, this is pure speculation on my part, okay? Take this or leave it. Don't go back to your preacher and say, well, Betty said. But perhaps they thought that their real sin in Egypt was not in trusting God for their provision. This brother and sister thing didn't have anything to do with it. Everybody did that. So it must be the fact that they didn't trust God for the provision. And so this situation is different. We're not talking about provision anymore. This is a new kind of fear. They're rich now. They got all the provisions they could ever want. Now, it might be that richness that caused their fear now. Somebody might rob them. Now their fear was for their safety. Do we feel comfortable trusting God for some things in some areas of our lives, but not for other things in other areas of our lives? I mean, look at Abraham's excuses. He says, she really is my sister. I didn't technically lie. But we have to remember that anything, even if it's technically true, when it's said with the express purpose of deceiving someone, is just as much a lie as if it were what we call a bold-faced lie, which that's what Isaac will do in chapter 26, a bold-faced lie. But then he goes on to say, but we've always done this. We've always done it this way, from day one. Abraham did not start out from Ur or from Haran with full and complete trust in God. We see that now because they've done that from the very beginning. From the time God called them, they made this deal between the two of them. If we get in a tight spot, in a dangerous spot, we'll say that you say that you're my sister. We questioned back then if Abram disobeyed God by taking his father and going to Haran, or if he continued to disobey God by taking Lot with him, when God specifically told him to leave his father's house and his relatives. And for me, this is even more evidence that he disobeyed God from the beginning, because he didn't trust God from day one. They had already worked this out. We've always done it this way. And not only that, but Sarah agreed to it. Remember, Abimelech said that she herself said, he's my brother. They've done this before. Now, we know they did it in chapter 12. We don't know if they've done it other places. That may be the only two instances. But they made this deal anyway, yeah.
I just have a question, because you have to be logical too and not put yourself in a situation that is unsafe.
Right.
And could they have just found themselves in an unsafe situation? Yeah. You have to still, I'm not going to go down at 2 o'clock in the morning on Martin Luther King when that's where they have all the drive-by shootings. Right. Because that's stupid on my part.
Yeah, exactly. You don't go stand in the middle of the interstate.
And I can't, and I'm not going to do that and say, but I trust God and He's going to protect me. You still have to.
I see what you're saying with that, but what I think happened here is they didn't realize the danger in this city until they were already there. But remember, they've been all over the place. Several places that they moved from here to there, to there, to there, and not felt in danger. Even when they were in places of Canaanites, or there were places. I think there were in one place where there were some Hittites, and when they were around different peoples, they didn't feel that fear, apparently. So I think then they came into this city that it caught them unaware and caught them off guard, and they feared for their safety.
So should they have just turned around and gone and left?
What I was thinking as I was studying this was, you find yourself in that place through no intention of your own. If it's possible to leave, you do. Or I think it happened so quickly that they didn't have an opportunity to leave, or at least that's the way it appears. But when you find yourself in one of those situations, let's say you're driving somewhere and you have a flat tire. You certainly did not plan for that flat tire to happen there.
Right.
So you are in a place where you feel unsafe, but you have to trust God, that God will take care of you. Even with they found themselves in this place, they should have known to trust God. He had taken care of them in every other situation. He can take care of this one now. But what, for me, the three fingers pointing back is that I have this tendency to trust God here, but I'm scared here. And I should not be, because if I can trust Him here, I can trust Him here. I guess that's why I see in what they've done this situation, because I know how I respond to things and how I struggle in different situations with not trusting fully when I should. You see where I'm going with it? I think they found themselves in this place and they should have trusted God, but it was an entirely different type of fear than they had before, an entirely different type of need than they had before. And so the old, she's my sister, just blurts out as a defense mechanism. You go back to what you're used to, I guess. Chuck Swindoll said, Abraham is not the only one returning to the same sin again and again. You and I return to the same patterns of sin. We bring the same things to the Lord again and again. And I know I do. I mean, you guys may not do that, but I know that I do. I mean, imagine God saying, you got that again? Yeah, I'm scared again. So, anyway, any other thoughts on that before we go on? Okay, verses 14 and 15. So then, just like out of the blue, Abimelech then took sheep and oxen and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, settle wherever you please. Remember, that's another thing that was different. Remember what Pharaoh did? He run them out of town on a rail. He escorted them out of town, got them out of Egypt. Well, here, Abimelech said, you can go anywhere you want to go. My land is your land. Just, let me give you all this and go. So, I'm like, wait a minute. Abraham's the one who lied, Abimelech was the one who was innocent.
Yeah, but God said, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah, if you don't clear this up, right? But it's Abimelech who gives Abraham the gifts. I mean, what's up with this? I mean, think about this. If you read this chapter, if you didn't know anything else about Abraham and you didn't know anything about the Abrahamic covenant and you just dropped in out of the blue and you read this chapter without knowing anything else, who would you think is the good guy and who's the bad guy?
Vice versa.
Vice versa, exactly. Abimelech was a man of integrity, as we said a moment ago. I mean, he may not have been a man of faith, but as we said, there are a lot of good, honest people who are not believers. But aren't we glad that it's not honesty and it's not morality that saves us? There's no works. Nothing we do saves us. We do those because we're saved, but that's not what saves us. But Abimelech was the one who's duped, and none of it's his fault. Abraham caused all the trouble. But God had made a covenant with Abraham, an unconditional covenant. Remember, it was God alone who walked between those animals. Abraham did not participate in that. It was all God. And God didn't say, now, if you're a good boy, I'll bless you. God said, no, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. Well, Abimelech didn't curse Abraham, no. But remember that word for curse in those who the one who curses you is a word that means to bring harm to or to mock. And what Abimelech had done had brought harm to Abraham, even though it was Abraham's fault. Grace. I mean, it's pure and simple grace. Remember, grace means God giving to us what we do not deserve. But there's more to it than that. And I read this in one commentary and I thought, I don't know, I hadn't heard that before. And then I found it another place. So I'm going to share this with you. What's actually happening here was according to Middle Eastern law. And that is when a dignitary, or in this case a prophet, I forgot to say that, he called him a prophet. It's the first time the word prophet's been mentioned in Genesis. But when a dignitary, or in this case a prophet, has been wronged, even if it's in ignorance, restitution must be made. And so that's what Abimelech is doing. He's making restitution for the wrong that he did, even though it wasn't his fault. That didn't matter. The law said when a dignitary is harmed, restitution must be made. And a sidebar here, we know, and so what he gives them, sheep and oxen and male and female servants, and he gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Now, just random thought came to mind. When Pharaoh gave Abram all these animals and these male servants, these female slaves, we know that's where Hagar came from. What crossed my mind was, I wonder if one of these female servants here will be Keturah, who he marries later. Just a random thought. I'll research that more when we get to that chapter, but I thought, I wonder, because we don't know anything else about these people that were given to him. But not only does Abimelech pay restitution to Abraham, he does to Sarah too. Look at verse 16. And to Sarah he said, Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, it is your vindication before all who are with you, and before all men you are cleared. Now, all these years as I've read this, and it said, I have given your brother, I thought he was saying that sarcastically. Look, I gave your brother. Yeah, you said he was your brother, and I gave your brother, but that's not what it is. What he is saying, by saying, I gave your brother this, what he is saying is, in the innocence of my heart, I thought he was your brother. Of course, I would still think there's a little sarcasm there, but it was, they say, from what I've studied, that the reason he put it that way was to say that he was innocent. But verse there in verse 16, that silver, my translation says 1,000 pieces of silver. I meant to go and look that up, but I got one of the commentaries said that was the equivalent of about 25 pounds of silver, and I thought, today's prices, that's about $14,000 that he gave. Yeah. But anyway, then this part of it has always intrigued me. In fact, this was what I was thinking about in the entire writing the lessons and before I even began studying it. This part has always intrigued me. Verses 17 and 18. Well, let me say this. One of the translations say that Abraham told him he would pray for him. And no, it's just, I don't see that anywhere. I don't really ever see him asking Abraham to pray for him. But at any rate, he does. Verse 17, and Abraham prayed to God, and God healed. Now, that's a word Rophe. We hear of Jehovah Rophe, the Lord our healer. God healed Abimelech, so something had happened to him, and his wife, so something had happened to her too, and his maid, something had happened to them, so that they all bore children. It's not that they stayed there for 9 months to see that they were going to have children, but that they were able conceive at that. Whatever had happened to them, that had gone away, and so they were able to have able to bear children now, or to get pregnant. But here's what intrigues me about this. Here we have a man whose wife has been barren. God has said that she's no longer barren, that she will get pregnant. But she has been. She has been barren all these years. She still isn't pregnant yet. So here's this man whose wife has been barren and still isn't pregnant yet, who is praying for other people to have children. Do you not see the irony of that? Have you ever prayed for someone else the very thing that you needed yourself? And God answered your prayer for them, but hadn't answered your prayer for you. I've had that happen, and I've cried out, God, why do you answer my prayers for others, and you haven't answered my prayer for me, for that particular situation? But just the irony of that. Don't you know that Abraham had prayed that very prayer for Sarah for more than 25 years, or at least the last 25 years we know of, and probably way before that. And yet here he's praying it for Abimelech and all his maids, and God answers it for them. God had told Abraham and Sarah that within a year they would have a son. She's not pregnant yet. But God, here, just as I was working on this today, this hymn just came to mind. God has just shown Abraham, as the old hymn goes, it is no secret what God can do. What's the rest of it? What he's done for others, he'll do for you. And so that's where we'll pick up next week. So, what hit you as you read this week? What intrigued you? What surprised you? What questions did you have? Did we answer the questions that you had? They can't hear you nodding your head on here.
I have an off-the-wall question.
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay for a married man to have a whole bunch of a wife and a whole bunch of servants that he impregnates. But take him a married woman,
Mm-hmm.
and that's considered adultery. But he is not committing adultery with all these servants.
Yeah. Because they're not married to somebody else. They're all... Polygamy apparently is okay. But adultery is not.
Doesn't it say that Solomon had 700 wives?
Yeah.
When did it become okay?
It didn't. That's one of those areas that we've talked about. Sometimes the Bible is prescriptive and sometimes the Bible is descriptive. In Genesis chapter 2, it says one man and one woman,
right.
and also I think it's Matthew 19, either 18 or 19, that Jesus says the same thing. God never changed his mind. That's descriptive. The rest of it is prescriptive. It just tells us what they did. It does not say that God said it was okay. It does not say that God approved of it. It just says that's what they did. And all we have to do to see whether it was approved by God or not is to look at the consequences. When you look at David, and David had several wives, and you look at that, and you look at the consequences of that. Here's something that I have often wondered about. If we said that Abraham quit looking for what was right and looked for, I forget what it said, anyway, looked for safety. I've often wondered, there's several instances of this in the Bible, but for instance, when we get to Jacob, and Jacob goes to his uncle Laban, and we know he falls in love with Rachel. And we know what Laban does. Switches out Leah. I've often wondered if Jacob had said, I'm going to do what's right and only marry Leah, what would have happened? How would it have been different? Would she have had all 12 of the sons? We know that Judah, from whom the line of Jesus comes from, was from Leah, not Rachel. What if Adam had said to Eve, I'm not going to do it. That's not the right thing to do. What would God have done? If Bathsheba had said to David, like Abigail did, don't do this, it's not right, what would have happened? Because we know God had already told David that a son that he would have would build the temple. We know that son was going to be Solomon. We know that he is going to marry Bathsheba eventually. But what if they'd done it God's way? Yeah,
what if Judas hadn't betrayed him?
Exactly. What if Judas says, I'm not going to do this? Now, Jesus does say, and I can't give you chapter and verse, but what Jesus does say is that one of you will betray me, and woe to the one that it is. And in fact, at the Last Supper, they all say, is it I? It could have been any one of them. If it had not been Judas, it would have been one of the others. Someone, because the prophecies all say he's going to be betrayed. He will be betrayed by someone. Yeah. I lay awake at night sometimes and think about, what if they had done what they were supposed to do? But I don't know. Well, anything else that struck you about this chapter that you enjoyed or liked or surprised you or anything?
Well, they must have been there for a while for them to figure out that none of the women were dead. Right?
Yeah.
So
It had to have been a while.
Yeah.
It couldn't have been more than 3 months because because we get to chapter 21, then that's when she gets pregnant, when they leave there.
Right.
So, but it could have been 2 months and 29 days. I mean, we don't know. But yeah, that was one of the first notes that I wrote down. How long were they there in order to know this? Because I was reading it as no children were being born. I thought, well, they weren't there 9 months. How do they know? And then, as I did more study on the words, it was that no children were being conceived. So,
But you could extend it to the livestock, because they can get produce rather.
Oh yeah, quickly. Yeah, that's how they had so many of the livestock. So, but this is one chapter that, particularly this last part, has always just convicted me. That he prayed for them, and that prayer was answered, but his hadn't been, and he'd been praying this for a long time. And so that just there's several in this chapter that convicted me, but that one in particular. So, anything else? Answered all your questions. Good deal. Okay. All right. So next week we'll pick up with the time is here, the baby. All right. Well, let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for your word. Even